It's great to be able to hear your voices and a couple of weeks ago when we were learning our Bamidbar stuff, it started me on a journey. I happened to be part of a group that was started by one of my nephews. I have a nephew who lives in Chicago. His name is Shua Brown, who's originally from St. Louis. And he started just family. He started something, he calls it Torah, and it's what's called a chabura. It's a group of people that get together to share Torah. And usually there's some kind of research. It would be sort of the equivalent of delivering a paper at a conference. You are doing private research, and then you're sharing the results of your research with your colleagues, as it were. So this is set up, so it's my nephews, my brother-in-law, a bunch of nephews, and my kids. So altogether, there's maybe 15 people that are a part of this. And every month, one of the group presents a chabura, it's called. And it's a kind of, again, it's a learned discourse. You have a choice. You can either do it as a video or you can do it as a written product. And so you could write it as a paper. So I knew that I was on the calendar for doing one for April 1st. And so when we were doing our study and we got to that part about the Levium being switched for the firstborn, it sort of tickled. There were certain elements of it that sort of tickled my curiosity. And so I told my nephew, I think I'm going to do it about the fast of the firstborn. And I've talked to you a little bit about this since then. So I just finished it yesterday. I can send it to you. It's not entirely friendly. I mean, it was written in a friendly way, but not everything is translated. But even if not everything is translated, you get the gist of what's being said. And essentially what I was doing was like a review of the custom, the custom to fast, that the firstborn fast on Erev Pesach. So it's the who, the what, the when, the how, and the why of this custom. And it ended up being a very fascinating journey because it's sort of a funny custom. There's all sorts of quirky details about it that we've become so used to seeing it happening. For the people who are not firstborns, it's not as much on their radar. If somebody's a firstborn or they have a firstborn as a child, it could be on their radar, and you notice that somebody is making a siyum. They're finishing a tractate, and everybody's sort of listening in and thereby absolved of having to fast, because the custom was that on the 14th of Nisan, a firstborn would fast from first light until Kiddush. And so it was a sort of, just because it really ends up being a sort of quirky minhag, which has all sorts of anomalies, it just became sort of interesting. And then there were some interesting little branches that emerged along the side. But so essentially what happened was the first actual written, the first clearly written indication of this custom occurs in a minor tractate called Masechet Sofrim. There are tractates that are more like the moons of Talmud than they are Talmud itself, like or Mishnah. They're Breita material. They're called minor tractates. They're technically not part of Shas. Like if you're studying Daf Yomi, you do not study these. Even if you're studying Mishnah, let's say you wanted to complete the 6 orders of Mishnah, you don't study these. But they are very influential. The character of their teachings is Breita. So it's from the time of Mishnah, but it's not Mishnah itself. So that's why I'm calling it sort of like the moons of these tractates are sort of like the moons of Mishnah or Talmud. So one of them is called Masechet Sofrim, and in that tractate, it doesn't explain it. It just says, acknowledges the custom, that there is a custom. It says regularly you're not supposed to fast during Nisan, but there is a custom for firstborns to fast on Erev Pesach. And that's an exception. It doesn't actually use the word custom. It just says there's one of the exceptions is that the firstborn fast on Erev Pesach. That's the first and most clear reference to this custom. So that's, if you're dating that text, it's probably somewhere between 200 and 500, around there. So you already have a clear reference to the custom going back to that time, but no explanation for it. The earliest explanations you see for this custom are like in around the 1200s, where, and there are several, even there, just sort of very brief explanations. And the explanations are consistent, that since the firstborns were saved from the plague of the firstborn, therefore they fast on Erev Pesach. They were saved because they were saved from the, that's actually the language of the Tur, who's writing in the 1300s, Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim. Again, these are extremely influential scholars writing in texts that everybody's reading. And over there, his language actually is because of the miracle that they were saved from the plague of the firstborn. That's why they fast. Now, this is just shocking to see those words, and that's basically it. There's no elaboration. And you'll see commentaries later on who are going, why is that a reason to fast? They should be celebrating on the 14th. The firstborn should be celebrated. They were saved. We have holidays like Hanukkah and Purim. We celebrate because they were saved. You don't fast because they were saved. So this created a kind of wave of like other explanations, or at least explanations that would somehow, maybe they don't entirely reject this, but they somehow work with it and develop it in another direction. So one popular one was written by the Chassam Sofer. So the Chassam Sofer is Rabbi Yechezkel Sofer. He's living in Prague, and he's in the 1800s, like around the middle 1800s. So you see, this custom is most likely started by the time he's writing it, it most likely started 1300 years before he's writing about it. And he's still like, they're still working. It was one of the things I loved about this was you get an opportunity to see the evolution of a custom, but not just the evolution of the custom, but how the scholars are sort of managing the evolution of the custom. In other words, they're not really managing it. That's the point. They're sort of observers. They're trying to figure out what happened. They're trying to explain, account for the details of what's going on. So this is before you ever get to a siyum. This is just, why is there a fast? So he suggests that what probably happened was that since the firstborn knew beforehand, everybody knew beforehand, because Moshe knew beforehand, that the firstborn Egyptians are going to be killed on that night, on the 15th at night. Because they knew about that, they most likely would have fasted the day before to make sure that they merited to be saved. This is the Chassam Sofer's explanation. So when the firstborn fast now, they are remembering an actual fast that probably occurred the day before, as the firstborn wanted to make sure that they deserved to be saved by God when the when the other firstborn are being killed. So that's his way. He doesn't completely reject the explanations. Obviously, he's not in a position to. These are sort of giants of halacha, and they're very important in the establishing of halacha in general. So it wouldn't be his style to completely reject them, but he sort of works with it, and he comes up with an explanation that'll help to account. Because otherwise, why aren't these people celebrating? They should be celebrating. They shouldn't be fasting. So that's his explanation. So at some point, probably around his time, there started to become this custom where people were making a siyum and celebrating the completion of tractates, and thereby not having to fast on Erev Pesach. The custom sort of emerges, and again, there's no clear explanation for why it's happening. It doesn't seem to be top down. It seems to be happening from the grassroots. And it's sort of emerging a little bit at a time. And you can see it in the writings of scholars where they're taking note of it, but they don't understand the kind of legal support for it. They don't get where these people think they can do this. Now, there also were people that weren't fasting if they attended a bris or a pidyon ben on those days, because those also have what we call a sudas mitzvah, a mitzvah to have a feast. And so they were people that were not, as if a firstborn heard that there was a pidyon ben somewhere, they'd attend a pidyon ben or a bris, and thereby from fasting because they're attending a sudas mitzvah. So that one seems to have more support, but you even see in language over there that there were people who were really not happy even with that, unless the people were actually naturally a part of the party. In other words, if it's the father or the family of the child, then they didn't have a problem with it. Their problem was if people were just showing up to be a party to it. But that started to emerge on one flank as a way to sort of get out of it. And then there was these siyums that emerged to get out of it. Again, you can see in the writings of different scholars, like the Chafetz Chaim is writing already in the early 1900s, the Aruch HaShulchan, who might have been related to David, whose last name was Epstein. Do we decide if he's related to David? I don't remember. Anyways, the Aruch HaShulchan, also, both he and the Chafetz Chaim they take note of the fact that this custom seems to be emerging now for maybe a couple generations, where people are getting out of the fast by going to a siyum, and they find it sort of curious. The Aruch HaShulchan is like, I don't know where they think they can be lenient about this, and you see the Chafetz Chaim talking about it as there are those who do it. Again, it's clear from both of them that they believe that a firstborn needs to fast during the day.
Rabbi,
also,
yeah. Can you see where going to a pidyon ben would be kind of consonant? You and the baby have the same. You're the same in the same situation. I think that's great.
Right. That's how I end my chabura, by the way. I end it with that because of that. It's so ironic
Yes.
It's a tremendous, it's an irony. It's a tremendous irony. Yeah, so yes, I do. That's the funny thing. When you see them include Pidyon Ben in this, a great irony occurs at the end. So, but all right, so who is supposed to fast? So with Rabbi Yosef Karo, when he mentions this, he says that there is an opinion, and apparently this was not a small group, had an opinion that firstborn boys and firstborn girls fast. Ramosha Isserlish, writing in the 1500s, around the same time as Rabbi Yosef Karo, said it is not the Ashkenazic custom for girls to fast, but it's not just written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. It's mentioned even in other writings as well, that there were people that had a custom for girls to fast. There's another way that a woman might fast, which is let's say there's a couple who have a firstborn boy. This is true even according to Moshe Isserlish. If a couple has a firstborn boy and the father himself is also a firstborn, then the custom was the mother fasts on behalf of the boy till he becomes a bar mitzvah. So there were two ways that a woman would also fast on this. But otherwise, the Ashkenazic custom, and I don't know what's Sephardic, because even Rabbi Yosef Karo first said boys fast, and then he said, and some say that girls should also fast. Why? Because it seems agreed upon that at Makas Bechoros, at the striking of the firstborn, that both boys and girls were subject to this plague. So, and not just boys and girls, but an elder in the family, somebody who was considered the elder in the family would also be subject to it. So this seems to be pretty much across the board amongst commentaries, that Makas Bechoros itself struck firstborn boys, firstborn girls, or just elders of households as well. Besides the animals and other things, but for us, we're mostly concerned about the people. And that seems to be why there would have been a custom for girls to do it, for firstborn girls to do it as well. So, but also the Mishnah Brura mentions this, and it seems agreed upon that even the firstborn of a Levi or a Kohen, fast. And that's going to be interesting going later on, talking about this later on. So the fast itself, before it ever came up to Bris and Pidyon Ben or Siyums, the way you accomplish this, and it seems to have been a strong custom going back at least to those times, that the way it would be accomplished is that a Bechor from first light until the Seder would fast. Then at some point, it seems like these other options came up that help somebody get out of the fast. Why are you trying to get out of the fast? Because it's Erev Pesach. It's Erev Pesach, and it's very hard to fast on the Erev Pesach. The Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who is becoming, he during his lifetime, he was considered one of the most impactful scholars during his time. I remember when he passed away, it was like a year or two before, maybe a year before we moved back to Chicago in Israel. So he passed away, and there were, according to the estimates at the time, there were probably 300,000 people at his funeral. And I remember listening to Israeli radio, and the on-air radio personalities were trying to figure out who this man was, because why was there such a massive funeral? There were 300,000 people at a funeral, and they never heard of him. And you hear these guys going, I've looked him up and everything. I've searched, I mean, this is pre-Google, but I've searched everything, the who's who. I've asked my friends. Nobody knows who this man is, because he was known, like in the yeshiva world and in the Hasidic world. and even in certain elements of the Sephardi world in Israel, you had to be in mostly in Israel, or if you were in the Yeshiva world, you would have known about him anywhere because influence. He was a beautiful man. I met him. He had a great smile, and he was just noted as being just a wonderful man. Anyways, and he's becoming, as his writings are being published, his opinions are becoming more and more influential when it comes to contemporary halachic discussion. So several years ago, his stuff, and maybe he had been talking about it before, but his stuff, as his stuff is being printed. So one of the things that went around is his take on this fast. So he asked several questions. One of his questions is, why is the Ashkenazi custom for just boy? If this is about what happened at Makas Bechoros, why is it the Ashkenazi custom that only boys are fasting? Why aren't the girls fasting? If this is really about what happened that night. And also, he says that he asks that once you've pushed it off, because that night is really the 15th. The night when Makas Bechoros happens is the 15th, the Seder night. That's when Makas Bechoros happens. So you're already not recalling this when it happened. And that's obvious why you wouldn't. It's a Seder night. You're not going to have a fast on the Seder night. So you're pushing it earlier. Once you're pushing it earlier and it's not on its right moment, why would you put it on Erev Pesach? First of all, it's inconvenient. And second of all, Erev Pesach is a quasi-holiday. I mean, it's got elements of it that are quasi-holiday already. That was the day when the Korban Pesach was brought. And when a Korban was brought, that's a celebratory day. So Erev Pesach itself, the day before the Seder, is itself a quasi-holiday. Why would you put a fast there if you didn't need to? You're already pushing it off. Push it off a day earlier. And then he also asked the question that that others had asked, which is, why is it a fast? Why isn't it a celebration? Because the actual language of the Torah is, you're doing this in remembrance of the miracle that happened to the firstborn. You're remembering the miracle that happened to the firstborn. That should be a cause for celebration, not a fast. So because of these, he comes up with an entirely unique explanation for what happens. And this really touches on what we were studying. Because he says that what's going to happen is, on Erev Pesach, amongst the various people that are bringing their animals, you're going to have some firstborn. And these firstborn are going to see the Kohanim and the Levim in their glory. Because when the Korban Pesach was brought, it was like the Beis HaMikdash was on show. You have everybody is out on duty. Everyone's wearing their dress whites. You have the choir is singing. Everything is in its glory. The Beis HaMikdash is really it's having one of its finest public moments of the year. Maybe Yom Kippur rivals it, but one of its finest public moments of the year. And the firstborn realizes that could have been him, because originally it was supposed to be the firstborn, and that was the stuff that we had been studying. That and we saw it in Bamidbar, but it's also later on in chapter 8, which is in Baal Loscha or Baal Loscha. I don't remember what chapter 8 is. I think it's this part is in Baal Loscha, where it said that but it says this in more than one place, at least two places. It says, God says, I sanctified the firstborn on the night of the Makas Bechoros, which, in other words, I protected them. How did I protect the Jewish firstborn? I protected the Jewish firstborn by sanctifying them. And so it seems like, and from the discussion that happens in those few verses, it's not, you can't get all the data. There's not enough data to get an absolute complete picture, but what it seems that those verses mean is that he declared, they are going to be sanctified to me, and they are going to be the ones who are going to carry out the service in the Beit HaMikdash. And then the golden calf happens, and the firstborn lose this gift. In other words, they are no longer going to do the service, and that's why we do Pidyon Ben. They are redeemed. So when that firstborn is seeing the Kohanim and the Leviim in their glory, he is having a moment, a time of cheshbon nefesh. He is looking inward. He is sad. He is ashamed of that behavior that happened at that time, and because of it, he lost out on this opportunity. So we sort of encourage the fast so that the firstborn can fully experience and live that, because it's a very important lesson. So that's Rav Shlomo Zalman's explanation for the fast of the firstborn. And why it's on the 14th, because that would have been the day when he's feeling it. He's feeling it, that moment that we want to sort of enable him to fully experience that, because it's a healthy thing for him to experience that, the sadness at the loss of that, because he could have, as a firstborn, he could have had that, and he doesn't have it. So there are some issues with obviously, and again, this is one of the other things that was sort of useful about this exploration, which that you see that when it comes to customs, nobody's explanation covers all the details, and they're not really expecting to. They're trying to get close. But if they don't cover all the details, it's still a challenge, but they're not giving up on their idea just because some of the questions don't come up. On this one, there's a couple of things that you could ask. Why is the Levi and the Kohen, why are they fasting? They didn't lose out. If you have a Bechor who's a Levi or a Kohen, then they're serving in the Beit HaMikdash. They certainly aren't feeling any shame, etc. And the custom is that a Levi or a Kohen still fast. Also, you have to ask yourself, what happened to the girls? This is not just on him. This is a question on everybody. But what happened to the girls? How did the girls get saved? In this explanation, the boys get saved because they're dedicated to serving in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. That's how they get saved. God's saying, these are my servants. You're not touching my servants. So they work in the Mishkan. But how did the girls get saved? Because the girl Kohanim, this is a question. This is my question. It's not a resolved. Obviously there's an answer to this. I don't know what the answer is. But according to this explanation, how did the girls get saved? Because they weren't made into Kohanim and Leviim. In other words, they don't serve in the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, they're not sanctified. They are not redeemed afterwards, most likely, because they don't have to be redeemed, because they weren't designated to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. But if they weren't designated to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, how did this destroyer not have access to them? Supposedly, the protection was that God is saying, these are my they work for me. You can't touch the people who work for me. But technically, they're not working for him. So how did those? So that's just a question that needs to. It sort of gets inspired by this discussion, and yeah. So so there's a couple things, but one of the questions that comes from this is just once you say this, that really the notion that the firstborn is they've lost. Why do we celebrate Pidyon Ben? Why do we celebrate Pidyon Ben at all? Pidyon Ben shouldn't be a happy occasion. Pidyon Ben should be a sad occasion. This was a child who could have served in glory in the Beit HaMikdash, and is not going to get a chance. They're going to be redeemed out. Why should that be a celebration? And especially because we see, according to Rav Shlomo Zalman, you're fasting because of it on Erev Pesach. And then at a regular Pidyon Ben, you're actually celebrating it. What are you celebrating it? It should be a fast day, the day when you do a Pidyon Ben. The father should fast instead of having everybody over and celebrating. So I was at a wedding the other night, and I happened to sit at a rabbi's table. I could tell you, I usually do not look forward to sitting at rabbis' tables. Not that I don't like rabbis, but what happens at weddings is there's an assumption that you want to sit, if you're a rabbi, you want to sit at the rabbi's table. At many weddings, because of that, don't sit with their wives. Because at weddings where there is mixed seating, this has happened to me, where I was at a wedding, everybody else gets to sit with their wife, but because I was the rabbi of the bride, I was put at a rabbi's table with people I don't even know, and my wife was put at some Rebbitzin table, and everybody else got to sit with each other. So I don't necessarily always look forward to sitting at the rabbi's table, but this one I did because they were almost all friends of mine, because one of the families was from Milwaukee, and so the rabbis had some Milwaukee connection, and there were a bunch of them were Turskis. But there was also this man, Rabbi Levine, who was my elementary school teacher, Rabbi Nachman Levine, for 3 years during elementary. Is very impactful in my life. And then Rabbi Michal Tursky was at the table, Rabbi Ephraim Tursky was at the table, Rabbi Ben-Zion Tursky from Milwaukee, and Rabbi Chaim Tursky from Lincolnwood. They were all shul rabbis. And Rabbi First was at the table. It was a good table. And so I was working on this thing. And so I asked them about this question about why isn't it funny that we would fast on Erev Pesach about the fact that this Bechor is not going to be serving, but we celebrate at Pidyon Ben. So Rabbi Ben-Zion Tursky suggested that the reason we celebrate is because Hashem told us to do this, which you could translate as, look, I want to do this, but this is what God wants me to do. And the appropriate thing for me to do in my relationship between me and God is to tell him I'm going to do it with joy. In other words, I obviously I'm being demoted. But I don't want to be demoted, but this is what God wants. And so I'm going to celebrate it. And it could be this, you have to say it sort of as Chassidish Torah, but this could be one of the reasons why we have the meal to celebrate it, because you're showing that even though this should be a demotion, I celebrate it. There's more likely reasons why it's a public thing, because this is a status change. Like things where there's a status change, it makes sense to do them very publicly. Let's say a wedding. You don't do it at a divorce. That's true, but you do it at a wedding. You make it very public. At a bris, you do it very public. At a pidyon ben, you do it very public. There's certain things where you could see the benefit of doing it public because there's some kind of status change that's happening. Although it could be argued that there are a lot of status changes, like conversions. You don't make for some reason, you don't do a sudas mitzvah at a conversion. And I guess it's not technically a mitzvah. That's why maybe there is a big status change going on there. And you don't do it at a divorce. A divorce, there is a mitzvah involved, but it's not one of those mitzvahs you necessarily want to do. But you could say divorce is sort of like this. I don't know. Anyways, so his answer was that the reason at a pidyon ben you're making this as a simcha is to show that reason. And so therefore you do a sudas mitzvah. So it could end up, and I went around the table and I said, do you like this? Do you like this? And we went around the table. And Rabbi Michal Tursky didn't hear it, but the others basically heard it, and they all said they like it. But then it ends up that you could have the same thing where you're having a sudas mitzvah on the one hand about something and you're fasting. In other words, the same thing could be the inspiration for a fast and a sudas mitzvah, and it makes sense. Each in its own context. So on Erev Pesach, it makes sense to fast. At a pidyon ben, it makes sense to celebrate. So that's what it ends up. And it's sort of, there's something sort of cool about that, where you could have something that, depending on the moment, it deserves to be celebrated or it deserves to be sort of fast. In other areas of life, that, depending on the context, it's either a source for celebration or a source for fasting. And then comes the thing that Lois was mentioning before. It's sort of a kind of a delicious thing, because if you have a pidyon ben, there were many people who were okay with the idea, if you had a pidyon ben on Erev Pesach, that would be a reason not to fast. So if you have a moment that mixes the two, the pidyon ben wins, so to speak. The joy wins, and that is a Hasidic. I think that's a good Hasidic approach there. That it works out really as a kind of a Hasidic finishing piece. That if I have a choice, I'm supposed to either celebrate, I'm supposed to fast. Of course, you're supposed to celebrate. Of course. So there's this guy. His name is Rabbi Anthony Manning. He has classes. The OU website has a lot of his classes. He likes to tackle mitzvahs that are sort of enigmatic, like this mitzvah. And so he has a thing about it. And he has a presentation. At the end of it, he says something pretty cool. He says that maybe this is, oh, and by the way, the siyum, so we saw, like if you look through the halachic development, you see even until relatively modern times, the main rabbinic figures did not think the siyum was a way to go. It seems like they didn't approve of it. Getting out of the fast with a siyum did not seem to be acceptable to them. And somehow it is now. And one of the biggest illustrations that somehow it became completely acceptable is Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. This is actually, there's a biography of him that was printed by Art Scroll, but it's a well-known thing that every Erev Pesach, he would make a siyum. And his siyum was on, this is every Erev Pesach, he made a siyum on all the Talmud. And when I say Talmud, I mean Talmud Bavli and the Jerusalem Talmud. And on all the Midrashim. He did a separate review of all the Mishnah, just as Mishnah. He siyum on the Zohar and on the Rambam and many other texts. This was a man who studied every minute of the day. So this was a gigantic, they called it a siyum on all the Torah, practically. Kol Torah kula. And he would make the siyum famously on Erev Pesach. He himself was a Bechor, and he and other Bechor, other Bechors would come to the siyum. So you can see by the time of Reb Chaim Kanievsky, which is in the last several decades, it had become perfectly acceptable to use a siyum as a way of resolving the fast and to not have to fast. It somehow became, and that's part of that was part of the pleasure I had at sort of working through this thing, was that I got to see a custom as it wends its way through, and it's working, especially in the last, as you see it sort of moving in the last 100 years or so, 150 years, a custom that's at least 1,300 years old, but it's wending its way through. And you see other major rabbinic figures who typically manage halachic outcome, and they are watching it happen, and they're just sort of watching it happen. It's just happening, and they're not managing it. They can't. They say what they would expect to do in their time, but they're already seeing something else emerge. This custom is emerging, and eventually it's going to overcome. It's going to take over, and it's going to be considered acceptable by almost everybody. There was like Ramosha Shapiro. I remember this. It's not a perfect memory, but I remember Ramosha Shapiro when my son Avram Yosef AY was born. He had some. I think there was something that came up that the pediatrician was somewhat concerned about, and so they didn't do the bris right away. And he was yellow, but then there was something else. So the bris got postponed. It ended up getting postponed for a few weeks. But he was born in Kof Vav Adar, 26th of Adar. At one point, it looked like it was going to be on Erev Pesach, and I Moshe Shapiro to be the Sandik. And I was told, not by him, I was told by somebody else that Moshe Shapiro, blessed memory, is himself a Bechor. And it would actually be sort of good for him, because he would be the Sandik at a bris, so he'd have to eat, because regularly he did not eat. If, in other words, Erev Pesach, unless it was a bris or a Pidyon Ben, he did not eat. He actually fasted. So clearly there are people that actually do fast on Erev Pesach. I'm calling that an incomplete memory. I checked with some of my friends, and they don't remember anything about it. They don't remember hearing anything like this, but I believe that's what happened at that time. That's what I think. So anyways, this Rabbi Manning was saying it's sort of appropriate comfort for the Bechor to have a siyum, because what's happening to the Bechor is losing the crown of the service to God, the crown of the priesthood, or the crown of the service to God. We call it Keser Kahuna. He's losing the crown of priesthood. But there's another crown. There's the crown of Torah. So the way you comfort him is saying, don't worry, there's another crown. You still have an opportunity to have a kind of royal relationship with God, and that is through Torah, and which I thought was beautiful. And then it reminded me of that piece from the Rambam that we've read at least twice in this class, which is where the Rambam says at the end of the laws of Shemitah and Yovel, which I'm going to read one more time because it deserves to be read as many times as it could possibly be read, which is, not only the tribe of Levi, but any one of the inhabitants of the world whose spirit generously motivates him or her, and he or she understands with his or her wisdom to set himself or herself aside and stand before God to serve him and minister to him and to know God, proceeding justly as God made him or her, removing from his or her neck the yoke of the many reckonings which people seek. he or she, is sanctified as Holy of Holies. God will be his or her portion and heritage forever, and will provide what is sufficient for him or her in this world, like he provides for the priests and the Levites. And thus David declared, God is the lot of my portion, you are my cup. You support my lot, blessed be the merciful one who provides assistance. So the Rambam is really suggesting that there is a way. In other words, if the Bechor truly is experiencing what Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was suggesting, that the for them to get it is by devoting themselves to the service of God. Anybody who devotes themselves to the service of God can themselves become like a Levi or a Kohen in God's eyes. And maybe that's also sort of symbolized by the Siyum, because that, again, would be one of the options. It's not the only option, but it'd be one of the options of the way you could devote yourself completely to the service of God is through Torah. So maybe that's also part of the symbol, and why it's an appropriate custom to have on this time, because again, it's an avenue towards comfort. So all of that was a result of an inspiration that happened during our class when we were studying about the Levium. That was over a month ago, and it resulted in this adventure that I got to take, and I'm grateful to you guys for that. Okay, so the next time we're going to meet will either be the 20th or the 27th, depending on what it feels like when I get home.
Well,
it's probably going to be the 27th.
One question about this, and
Yeah.
then all our salutations and good wishes and everything.
Yeah.
In that work where it shows up in the moon of the Barais, or whatever you're calling it, is there anything else, not particularly this, but other things that they were thinking about that might relate to this? I mean, that's kind of like a scholarly question, but you see what I mean? Other kind of customs, other things that were new. I just wonder about that, So. I can't hear you. Oh, shoot. What happened? What happened?
I mean,
we all lost him, Lois. We all lost
him. Particular one.
I think he's trying to speak.
Yeah, I think so too, but oh well, sorry.
What? You can't hear me?
We couldn't hear you.
You guys can't hear me?
No, we're getting interference too.
I am speaking. How did I lose? How did I get lost here?
Now we can.
Now I can hear you.
I think.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, sir.
What happened? I do not know what happened. Okay. So it says, now you can't? Hello?
Yes, we can.
We can. Go ahead.
Oh, you do?
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Therefore, we don't say, this is the quote from there. Therefore, we don't say Tachanun all the days of Nisan, and we don't fast until Nisan passes, except for the firstborn that fast on Erev Pesach, and the humble who, because of the matzah and wanting to enter into Passover with a desire for matzah, and the students who fast on Monday and Thursday because of the desecration of God's name and because the building was burnt down. So those are different fasts that were allowed at the time of Maseches Sofrim. And the commentaries try to find out what that fast of the Tuesday and Thursday is. There's all different opinions. And they also talk about that custom. There might have been a custom amongst certain individuals to fast on Erev Pesach so that they could eat the matzah with relish, to eat it with relish. There is a Talmud Yerushalmi that says Rebbe fasted on Erev Pesach. And they said, at first they said, is it because he's a firstborn? And then they said, no, there were other firstborns who don't fast on that day. So then they said it's most likely because he was like, they called him an istinus. He's a sort of finicky person. And if he would eat, he wouldn't be hungry for the Seder. So therefore he just didn't eat or something like that. So that's the text about fasting. And it does have some quirky other things. So I guess there is some room for looking at that, discussing it. I'll send it to you and you'll see if you see any more things you want
Thank
to
you.
look at. Thanks.
Rabbi,
Alrighty.
have a wonderful Pesach.
All right, safe trip,
Service.
You
May a
too.
wonderful
safe
trip.
travels.
Enjoy the family.
And
You
to
too.
all of you
Um,
fellow students, yes. Thank
All right. Be well,
Bye,
guys.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Hugs and
Everybody be well.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.